we're in a room with one of the labs, and at the end of the meeting, there's a guy who kind of stands up and he saunters over to me, and he's like, "Hey, can you give me your phone so I can put my number in it?" And then he says, "Whatever your recommendations are going to be, I would just urge you to please be more ambitious." And so we're like, okay, that's sort of interesting. Well, let's chat offline. We ended up meeting him later at another location, and he started to share that essentially, in his view, his lab couldn't be trusted. They were being irresponsible on both the safety and security sides. He was really concerned about weaponization and loss of control.
Do they own the security risk? Do they concede the point, or are they like, no, we got this, it's fine? Or are they like, no, we're Swiss cheese?
So, well, I mean, internally for many of the labs, the self-assessment is like, yeah, we're Swiss cheese.
Welcome to For Humanity, an AI Risk podcast, episode number 36, the AI Risk Investigators Inside Gladstone AI, part 2. I'm John Sherman, your host. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the AI safety podcast for the general public, no tech background required. This show is solely about the threat of human extinction from artificial intelligence. If you are new to this show, let me introduce myself. I'm just a dad in Baltimore who thinks AI is going to kill his kids, has a background in communications, and is doing everything he can to wake up the world to the unthinkable, unconsensual extinction risks the frontier AI labs are subjecting every human on Earth to. You don't have to believe me. Believe the CEOs of the big AI labs who openly admit their tech can kill all life on Earth. Openly admit they cannot control this same technology, openly admit they do not understand how this same technology works. Oh, and by the way, they're spending all their time and money making it stronger and smarter, not safer. That's where we are. So I have another big show for you today. The second part of my conversation with Jeremie and Edouard Harris, the CEO and CTO of Gladstone AI, two of the most important people on the planet, the two heads of the team working most closely with the U.S. government on assessing and investigating frontier AI risk. On an ongoing basis, Jeremie and Edouard Harris and their company Gladstone AI are working with the U.S. government to understand AI risk at the big frontier AI labs. They are meeting with top executives and their teams. They are meeting with whistleblowers at the big labs. They are doing this vital work right now. They are very concerned about the loss of control, but they are more concerned about the security environments at the big AI labs. They think we need strong regulations on AI labs, and I can certainly agree with that. I don't need or want to completely agree with everyone who wants to slow down AI and regulate the big labs. We can share goals, but have different reasons for them. We are building the largest mass movement in human history, and the only way to do that is with a big tent, welcoming diverse opponents of unregulated, uncontrolled AI. So please hit like right now, subscribe if you haven't, share these videos, and donate to buy ads so we can help spread the word if you can. Also, feel free to email me at forhumanitypodcast@gmail.com with your thoughts about any of this. After the interview, I will have some thoughts on AI risk realism, what some call doomerism, believe it or not, as a means to better mental health. And I'll have some exciting news about a brand new AI risk initiative that I will be launching in the coming weeks and months. But first, here is part 2 of my interview with Jeremie and Edouard Harris of Gladstone AI. It's a year from now. China has overtaken us because they have somehow, busted through their bottlenecks in some way. What would the world look like if the U.S. was in the position China is in right now and China was in the position the U.S. is in?
I think one answer to that is you would probably see a lot of focus on cyber offense from the U.S. Not that there isn't right now, but that my first guess is that would become a top priority real fast, because these AI technologies also they augment your cyber capabilities too. So that's a compounding issue. You fall behind by a year, you have access to weaker cyber weapons, which makes it harder to do IP theft and exfiltration yourself, which then makes you fall behind further. So there is a sort of risky dynamic in that sense that, it's perhaps has some winner take all elements. And so I think that lends itself to the strategic instability problem here. The other piece too is, right, just to kind of lean into the strategic instability piece, cyber attacks are a lot harder to attribute. It's also a lot harder to attribute just in general AI attacks, right? The design of a new bioweapon, people start getting sick. You got to work backwards to figure out, who set this in motion. And we're still debating COVID and all this stuff. Well, designer cyber weapons that are designed by AI, which are a very plausible thing that kind of on the table now, have that property. So a lot of these things make attribution really hard. And I think that's part of the challenge and part of the strategic imperative for the US to stay ahead, considering all of the sort of control issues that we also have to solve for, the security issues. But I think that's, a piece of the puzzle for sure.
Okay, so let's get back on the timeline and go to like 2021. You guys have, so you took the call. He said drop everything. Obviously, you guys did drop everything. Walk me through, as you transition from YC guys working on tech stuff that's just tech stuff to guys who are working on the most important problem in the history of humanity.
Well, we kind of fork out, right? So the first thing that happens is we try to figure out, okay, one of us has to, there's a policy side, there's a technical side. And we both decide that we each have to be really, really knowledgeable in both. But we also are going to have to figure out ways to specialize. So Ed goes deep on the technical side, does actual alignment research with many of the world's top AI alignment researchers. Like he spent a year plus, actually like a year and a half, 2 years, producing first of its kind research on power seeking, on AI control. I ended up doing a bunch of policy engagement work. We also hooked up with a sort of a family friend of ours who had some connections into the kind of DoD universe and made some intros. That's where we started to do this. We call it the World's Saddest Traveling Roadshow. We go around, we brief anybody who would listen, really, like Homeland Security, State Department, DoD, wherever. And we ended up landing on this team at the State Department. And this is a really interesting team that we can't say too much about, but they have a very unusual interagency mandate. And what this means is, you're one team siloed in one kind of department in the U.S. government. Normally, you don't have the authority to just reach out to anybody you want to, right? You can't just talk to like somebody at DoD. There's a process for doing that kind of thing. This team, for various reasons, has the sort of mandate to do that in a much more efficient, kind of low overhead way. That's structurally how they're designed to roughly cartoon it. And
just a quickly asterisk that. You're allowed to talk to people across the interagency, but you can't really do active coordination of an initiative that cross-cuts. So the State Department kind of stays in the State Department lane, DoD stays in their lane, et cetera. That's typically how it works, but not with these folks.
That's for sure. The idea is to prevent, that mandate creep. So essentially, we have a representative. So we have this meeting. There's 12 people from the State Department, one representative from this particular team. And for months, we'd been hearing people say, wow, this sounds like a really important problem for somebody else to solve. And this is the first time somebody
should get on this.
Yeah, that's right. And the funny thing was, we were never really getting like the everything is fine meme. We were getting genuine understanding. Part of this was we'd spent so much time honing our messaging, because in order to keep this entire ridiculous exercise afloat, among other things, we'd stood up an entire for-profit arm to our company that focused on AI education and training, in particular for the national security community, DoD, and so on. That was really meant so that we wouldn't have to take a dime of external funding from any of the politically or ideologically aligned entities that operate in this space. We wanted all of our recommendations to be able to come from us, be unfiltered. We'd seen just too many times and had initial engagements with some folks in the space where they just seemed really ideological, and we just had, even when they weren't, and there were cases where they were very reasonable people, you still could tell, like, taking this money is going to come with strings, and this is too important a problem to solve with, strings attached. And so we ended up doing this to basically just like make all the money we could to pay for our work on the policy side. The State Department team stood up, picked this up. They post the RFI, the request for information, basically the solicitation for this project, a month before ChatGPT drops. This is important because at this time, the US government was simply not tracking the AI issue as a core national security issue. As a result, there were no bells and whistles added to the contract that required sort of secrecy of a general kind. Normally, if you had a national security project like this, it would result in an artifact that gets shared internally to the US government. And beyond that, nothing public. We were able to go public with the result of our work in Time Magazine and all that stuff because of the timing and because we had a team behind us at the State Department that wanted the American people to be tracking what's going on. They felt that, we're not going to overclassify stuff. We have a responsibility to open this, and they lived up to it pretty remarkably.
Part of the reason why they were so adamant is that agreement, that initial agreement that we signed on with them, was what's called a cooperative agreement. So it wasn't quite a contract where it's like, here's a defined thing and you go do that. Rather, the cooperative agreement part means that you and elements of their team go and engage together on parts of the project. And so we went on fact-finding trips to, London, UK. We met DeepMind, a number of AI safety organizations, San Francisco, DC, all these kinds of places. And members of their team came along with us as we went. And so in many cases, they were speaking to the whistleblowers directly. They were engaging with these people directly. They were seeing and hearing things that we were seeing and hearing. And so by the end of the project, we had a cohort of people inside that office who were like, yeah, people need to know what's going on. And so it wasn't just a question of the artifact being public by default, as was the case typically for contracts like this, but would not have been the case if the contract had come out, later and before or after ChatGPT. But also there were individuals who pushed inside the organization for, no, this specific thing, this specific fact needs to be public. And they pushed successfully. And that's why so much of what we did is now visible in the public sphere.
And so help me understand sort of the shape of the assignment, what was the task that you were given by this State Department team to achieve?
It was an assessment. So there's official language somewhere, but it was, to paraphrase, it was an assessment of the safety and security situation in frontier AI and advanced AI generally. So advanced AI systems being, let's say, systems that have general purpose capabilities. So going beyond the sort of traditional narrow AI of the pre-2020 era. Yeah.
And how so it becomes basically, and I want to get all into this, it becomes basically like a detective story, kind of a little bit. Like, it's like you guys are out there talking to whistleblowers, having clandestine meetings, like all this really interesting stuff. How did you guys, physicists who were in tech companies, decide that we're the guys to put on the detective hats for this job? I think you guys did an amazing job. I'm so glad you did it. I'm just curious as to that moment where you're like, man, this is going to be fundamentally different work than we're used to doing.
I think to quote a friend of ours, sorry, I was just okay, sorry. It was just to quote a friend of ours. I think a big part of this is, if not you, who, if not now, when, right? We were looking around, and frankly, the AI safety community is interesting. We do not identify with any community, which is helpful because we have an external, we don't belong to the Berkeley ecosystem or the effective altruist ecosystem or any of these things. So we were able to kind of look from the outside as if we belong to a community, we belong to the community of Silicon Valley startup founders, and sort of YC baked into our bones. And from that perspective, you look at the AI safety ecosystem, and it really seems like there is a lack of action orientation and sort of agentic vibe to these people. You talk to people at parties, right? And they'd be like, oh yeah, I just heard this speaking of bad security at the labs, oh yeah, I just heard this crazy rumor at my lab that the next generation of models coming out and they're testing it with no sandboxing, no safeguards, whatever. And among other things, you'd be like, okay, cool. Well, that seems really important. What are you doing with this information? I mean, you seem genuinely distressed, and sometimes the distress is real, and legitimate. Other times people do freak out for nothing, and it's important to kind of tune that dial a bit. But certainly there were cases where we'd hear stuff. We'd be like, this calls for action. Every startup founder bone in our body was like, yeah, what you do with this is you pick it up and you do a freaking thing with it. That's how, that's how the world moves.
It comes down, and it comes down to a lot of things, and that cultural aspect is one. and it's also tied into the funding question. Because when we first entered the space, kind of end of 2020, we spoke to some of the organizations that were, at the time, the only ones that were doing any kind of funding of AI safety and security related activities. And the refrain from those organizations was generally, don't talk to government. Because if you talk to government, the government's not going to hear you about the safety side, but they're going to hear you about the super powerful AI side, and you're going to kick off a giant AGI project that the government's going to do, and they're going to screw it up. There's a lot of stuff in that view, and in many steps of it, it's just incorrect. We just found from talking to people in government, like you could, at the time, you could have talked to DoD for made it your mission to get them to start an AGI project, and you could not have done it. It's a battleship. It takes a career to turn an organization like that, among many other things that was wrong with that view. But because organizations like that were holding the purse strings of that ecosystem entirely, all they had to do was not care about an approach, for that approach just not to exist in the ecosystem. And so that's why we found ourselves at this time, we were the only ones who were doing this kind of engagement, because the whole kind of surroundings of us was just not being funded. We were the only ones who were like, yeah, we're startup people. So we naturally go to, yeah, let's build a business and fund this. It's not going to be easy, but it's doable. Like, we've done this path before.
Right.
Whereas the rest,
and to that, just real quick, because some AI safety people have I think maybe a mistaken impression of Gladstone and what you guys are doing. They think that, you guys are out there working with the military to, make a ton of money and do all this unsafe stuff. And, I talk about how, is there any downside to the for-profit business working with the government that gets in the way of the safety stuff? Or is it working as you envisioned, where you have this sort of clean funding source and this ability to work on safety like you want to?
Well, I would say there's more alignment even between the two sides than we expected. So one of the big lines of business that we have is training for government folks in all of these trends, like AI scaling, the risks, the capabilities, what's going to happen in the future, all that stuff, with a serious safety and security focus. The stuff that we're talking about on this call packaged into a course. And one of the things that we learned by delivering this course and building it and refining it with the Department of Defense was DoD, particularly DoD, already has an extremely strong existing safety culture. Not that obvious from the outside, but if you think about it, it's like, yeah, of course they do, because their shit kills people, and they need to make sure that the shit that kills people is as safe as possible, because it kills people. It's designed to kill people.
Yeah.
And so when you engage with DoD, there are entire organizations and all the services that are around testing and evaluations. Even before, ChatGPT, there was an existing AI test and evaluation organization inside the Air Force, inside OSD, which is the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and covers the armed services broadly. And we spoke to and engaged with these folks. And yeah, the view very much is the way we develop these kinds of systems, particularly ones in the kill chain, but that culture really does trickle down across the organization, is we start by defining the parameters within which we want that system to act and behave. And then we start building our system within those parameters and just constantly tracking, is the system ever moving outside the parameters? If it moves outside that set of parameters, that's a really big deal. And you stop everything and you have to understand exactly how and why that happened. This is basically exactly the way that you would want to do safe development of increasingly capable AI systems. And so from that perspective, it really was the exact opposite of what we were hearing originally from folks in the kind of AI safety space, kind of in those early days, which was, don't talk to government. They're just going to, run off, especially DoD is so bad at this and so forth. The actual reality when you engage with these folks is from over decades and decades and decades of building and deploying this technology, there is just an immense set of safety standards that are built, and everyone is very much safety oriented. Doesn't mean it's necessarily, it carries across every, department of the US government. It doesn't mean it's entirely universal. It doesn't mean geopolitical competition might not change the calculus there, but that's the default right now inside of defense.
And so if the government were running the big labs, let's just say, like hypothetically, the government were running the big labs, do you think it would be doing it in a fundamentally different way than the labs are doing it now if they brought in their sort of baked in safety culture? Like, what is the first one or two things you think they would get in there and be like, oh, hell no, we're stopping that and stopping that right now?
I think there's huge dependency on just the particular shape that takes, right? So the government running the labs is a very load-bearing phrase. So we could think about a lot of different interpretations of it. One of the key questions is always going to be, who is fundamentally in charge, right? Like, is it what department, what individual, right? A lot of the concerns that we've heard when we talk to, frankly, the whistleblowers that we've been speaking to, especially lately, there's concern over, for example, if you set this up, do you fundamentally get people who, at least these whistleblowers, consider have suspect, if not motives, at least MOs? So for example, is Sam Altman going to be de facto running the show as an individual who's demonstrated a really impressive capability when it comes to sort of getting people on side and wrangling boards of directors and refactoring the corporate structure of entities that he nominally did not control? This is a concern that we have heard echoed from these whistleblowers who, are in a position to at least know quite a bit about how things have played out there. So a lot of questions about who specifically is put in these positions. You look at, for example, the AI Safety Institute, right? The NIST AI Safety Institute in the US, right? Who's running that? Well, it's Paul Christiano. It's the guy who invented reinforcement learning from human feedback, or at least the applied version of it in OpenAI. He was the former head of alignment, very deeply knowledgeable about AI control issues, very, very concerned about the risk set, and a very serious dude. I mean, you think about, this is a common objection where people say, you couldn't have government regulate this space effectively because you're not going to have the talent on board. Well, we have the literal inventor of one of, if not the cutting edge AI safety technique used on planet Earth today at the world's top AI labs, who chose to work for the US government because that was where the influence is greatest. When all the labs are racing, no one has agency. No one's in control. So control ends up shifting. If you want to actually steer the ship, you got to think one level of abstraction higher. You got to move to the government, to the regulatory level. Everybody sees the same chessboard. They see it all. They know that Sam Altman's next move, it looks just like Demis's next move at DeepMind. It looks just like Satya's next move. Scale more, race to AGI. That means you're not actually fundamentally in control. If you want to shift the course of history, you do it from the higher level of abstraction, USG kind of regulatory space. We've seen similar things with the UK AI Safety Institute, like really world-class, like Ian Hogarth, amazing researcher, folks from Google DeepMind, from OpenAI, all flocking there. So I think overall, and actually we've spoken to whistleblowers too, who've told us in the course of this assessment that we ran, they'd come up to us and say, hey, we want to work with you guys, like with the US government on this. Can we please join? And our amazing US government counterparts would turn to them and say, son, you don't know what you're signing up for. Like, you're probably getting paid $1 million a year right now. You're going to take a 90% pay cut to work for us? And the response that they got was, yeah. That's the level of concern among some of these folks. But like, this is a really powerful recruitment tool, and it does fundamentally shift the art of the possible when it comes to regulation. It doesn't solve the problem, but it's a really, really important ingredient.
Yes,
it's so good. And so
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ed.
I'll just going to quickly say, yes, spotlighting the right agencies inside government. It's a PR question, but you absolutely can get top talent to go there. I will just quickly mention Ian Hogarth is, he's not a researcher. He's an angel investor and entrepreneur, but he is great.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously there's like the caricatures of the government, it's terrible bureaucrats. We have the ridiculous almost tropes of the like 85-year-old senator who's grilling the social media CEO and doesn't even know how Facebook works or whatever. And so there's this impression that the government is just really bad at tech. It's really, really encouraging what you guys are saying, that there is this sort of elite group that you're working with that is in the State Department, but has the ability to sort of move more broadly than that. Were you surprised? What was your sort of emotional reaction to finding that, like, when you pulled back the curtain on the government, it wasn't as shitty as everybody sort of makes it seem?
Okay, so the defining fact about the government that dominates everything else about it is that it's gigantic. And so what you said about, oh, the government is so bad at tech, it's like so shitty, it's behind, that is totally true. But the fact that we discovered there's an elite group that is so good at doing all these various things and is actually moving the ball forward in ways that, you know, a bunch of YC founders would have been proud to do, that is also true. So the government is so gigantic and heterogeneous that our experiences with the DMV just, you know, that gives us a window on one facet of the government. But also the government has a limited amount of high quality management bandwidth that it needs to allocate to different problems. And the thing is, the biggest problems that the government face sound like, how do we avoid a nuclear war with China? Like, that is where you allocate your highest quality people. Like, how do we prevent Russian encroachment on, like, the NATO flank? These are huge, gigantic problems. And the thing is that success at those problems to you and me looks like, oh, everything's fine again today, just like it was fine yesterday. And so the actions of the highest quality individuals in those spaces very often are aimed at just like preserving, you know, your experience of a normal life, which is very unlike how you see the actions of individuals in the private sector happen. So the most visible things that happen in the private sector often are just very large successes. And so we all kind of know the individuals, you know, the Elon Musks and like all the kind of big entrepreneurs who drive things forward in the private sector. Whereas in the public sector, the big successes look like, oh, we avoided a nuclear war today, and like fucking like nobody knows how close we came. But there were some elite individuals involved in the steps of that process. And so peeling back that curtain and realizing like, oh shit, actually, there's a ton of competence behind the curtain. It's just allocated in these spaces that are about just like holding the line, like keeping the game going. And yeah, moving things forward incrementally in terms of national security interests. But by and large, like if they're doing their job really well, it's just like, you know, you don't really necessarily notice it from one day to the next.
Now, government is also it's a really big word. It's not just a really big organization, but it encompasses the, you know, civil service and then the actual political level as well. Actually, I should flip those. Political level, right? And these two have very different characteristics. Like you see at the political level, think about the Senate, think about you know, just Congress in general, right? The House of Representatives as well. Like you have committees, and on those committees, you'll find a bunch of Republicans, a bunch of Democrats. And some of them have experience in tech in various forms. By the way, that can be one of the most dangerous categories of people. The people who know enough to be a danger to themselves, especially when they have like a background in tech that's like, you know, it goes to like 2005 or something, or they have like, you know, a master's or something from back in the day before the new paradigm came in, right? Yeah, it's very tempting to look at the new tech and be like, oh, well, we've been through AI winters before. And, you know, it sounds all mature and smart and wise to be like, don't worry, it's hype and this and that. That aesthetic is very sticky. It makes people feel really smart and it makes other people look up to you and it's fun to debunk. The challenge is when the paradigm actually does shift, right? And, you know, we're in a world where Microsoft is engaged in the single largest infrastructure build out in the history of human civilization, you know, spending $50 billion a year on clusters that they internally, a large subset of them believe are the AGI clusters, right? Like this is the world we live in. So, you know, if you have a particular person who has, you know, some view about the history of AI that they hold too strongly because of, you know, what may be somewhat outdated picture of where the technology is at, that could be really dangerous because you need a significant update. And then it doesn't help when you also have lobbying activities from these ridiculously well-funded organizations that are coming in and, able to fork over 40K, 50K to a candidate. Doesn't cost much. You've earned yourself a meeting, you're funding the campaign, like all of a sudden the wheels start to turn. So there's a lot of that we've been dealing with as well, and trying to figure out how do we, as a very, very small operation that's self-funded, try to make as much of an impact as we can given this whole landscape. So the political and the bureaucratic, two very different stories.
Sure. So, all right. So now let's talk about like putting the report together and doing these interviews and this investigation. So I guess you call up like OpenAI and you're like, hey guys, remember us? Yeah, we're working with the State Department now, and we are investigating what's going on with AI Frontier Labs, and we want to come and get a conference room full of you people and Sam Altman and everybody and sit down and tell us what's going on. And they're like, okay.
So we probably can't and shouldn't share too many of the back end details behind how the meetings were set up and so on. We did have meetings with OpenAI. We did end up connecting with many whistleblowers from across the various frontier labs. We had meetings with all the labs, by the way. It wasn't just OpenAI. We went to London in person. We went to New York. We went to San Francisco. We were there on the ground and speaking to whistleblowers after the fact, at be it bars or wherever, coffee shops, things like that. I think one of the interesting things about it was I think sense that the government was not tracking as much as it was. The team that we were with was really well informed. They went in understanding the landscape of concern because they had done their job, and they'd engaged with organizations on the safety and security side, organizations on the accelerationist side. We had conversations with companies that have a very accelerationist mindset. And the State Department team did too, and that was really important. We wanted to make sure everything was represented. We personally think that the benefits of the technology are incredibly significant. We need to find a way to capture those benefits. Like, we're not about stop AI right now. That's apart from just like being the wrong thing to do and being politically untenable. It also disadvantages the U.S. relative to China unacceptably. There are all kinds of things like we can't just take that sort of action.
That's correct.
Assuming we had good security, but this was really important to kind of get them exposed to the whole set of actors. So they spoke to safety labs, they spoke to the whistleblowers as well, and on site, and I think that was a really important part of the story as they started to develop their own views about what was true and what wasn't, so that when they were in the room with the Frontier Labs, they were able to assess in a very rigorous way the accuracy of the information they were being given. And I think that was an important ingredient in the whole process.
Yeah, and one of the big
Go ahead, Edward.
I was going to say, one of the big early factors to these conversations. Well, first so from the work that we'd done previously, that kind of the roots of this are when we went through YC, when we had this, this AI company and started building these networks. We had a lot of friends in these labs and just kind of across the board that we had initial conversations with. But one of the things that really helped was that this team at the State Department who came with us to these meetings displayed such obvious competence in this domain that you had individuals who, through conversations with them or through, any number of discussions and interactions, kind of realized like, oh, yeah, like the government's actually on this and these are the people who are going to do something about it. So like, I need to take my shot, or I need to find a way to engage. That's right.
This is actually, I think, a really important thing to flag explicitly. Like we heard repeatedly from some of the world's top AI researchers feedback about this team. And they were like, yeah, those guys are on it. I would never have bet that this would be possible in the US government. And this gives me hope for competent execution in the space. It can sound like we're just going overboard about this team or whatever. But the reality is we were in the same spot. We thought like there's no way it's going to look more like the DMV inside than that. So we are to this day genuinely shocked that this even happened. But it's just important to plant that flag that, yeah, actually you do have organs of the U.S. government that can behave competently, and it's important to activate them.
And so you guys are you're coming to like investigate your old I want to, it's not your old stomping grounds, but it's your old sort of like world. You're coming to like look at what's going on at these at the frontier labs. What was their attitude like towards the effort in general? Like, was it like, we have to do this? Or was it like, we genuinely, sincerely want to be safer. So let's take this important meeting.
I think
it depends. Yeah.
I think to what I was going to say, I think it depends on your interpretation. Again, we get back into the mind reading thing. Look, they opened their doors. They had the conversations. And I will say, there were some labs that were clearly, sincerely engaged on this and genuinely concerned. There was a spectrum, let's say, in our own personal assessment, which will be different from the assessment of any individuals at the State Department and different from the overall assessment of the US government and all of its components. Our own personal assessment was that there was quite a spectrum, and some were very genuinely engaged. I think, you always run into this challenge of doing mind reading, but certainly on the surface, on paper, the engagement was sincere and open. You can ask questions beyond that, but
yeah, there were. I would say that. Oh, sorry about that.
Go ahead.
There might be a delay. Sorry about that. I think there were a couple of labs where, again, nobody expected this team to be that competent. And so you had sometimes answers from, the official or policy team side that sometimes assumed that the folks that they were talking to were not necessarily that competent or not necessarily able to like kind of read, kind of see between the lines. And definitely they were very much able to understand very deeply what was going on. And so there were often, kind of maybe some mismatches there between what was said and maybe the realities that we and the team kind of were able to perceive under the surface. But again, it was very much a spectrum, and absolutely there were labs that were extremely high quality for all of these metrics, and really just great.
Wow. Okay. And so let's talk about the sort of emergence of whistleblowers, because if these companies are genuinely engaged in the effort, they probably don't want whistleblowers coming out and airing their dirty laundry or, telling you guys things that they're not telling you in the official meeting. So talk about the sort of like two tracks of this thing, where there's like the official meeting with the execs, and then this world of people coming up to you and dropping you notes and meeting in bars and getting the like real inside scoop.
Yeah, well, there was one, I think the most visceral moment. There were quite a few like this, but this one at least stood out to me. Was, we're in a room with one of the labs, and at the end of the meeting, there's a guy who kind of stands up and he saunters over to me, and he's like, "Hey, can you give me your phone so I can put my number in it?" And then he says, "Whatever your recommendations are going to be, I would just urge you to please be more ambitious." And so we're like, okay, that's sort of interesting. Well, let's chat offline. We ended up meeting him later at another location, and he started to share that essentially, in his view, his lab couldn't be trusted. They were being irresponsible on both the safety and security sides. He was really concerned about weaponization and loss of control as being factors, and just believing that his lab culturally and institutionally was not taking this seriously in the way that perhaps it should. And he shared some specifics that we can't necessarily relay. Others that were aligned, let's say, with concerns over foreign actors being able to exfiltrate weights, experiments that were being run, for example, on laptops with no safeguards, that sort of thing. We've heard that echoed by a lot of different people. Like, this is just so clearly the MO across the board today. So a lot of this was organic, right? So some of this is like, we just had friends, pre-existing friends. But the preponderance of these folks are folks that we connected with over the course of this. One person introduces you to another, to another, to another. And I think it was especially interesting because like our document came out, like the results of the assessment came out in early March. But we had a bunch of sort of feedback from these folks we were working with, whistleblowers and so on, that was really positive on the back end. And then, of course, famously, recently, we've had those OpenAI whistleblowers sort of come forward. The New York Times headline saying, I think it was Daniel Kokotayo there, saying, hey, there's a big set of issues here. And interestingly, like that group overlapped with, to a certain extent, the larger group that we've been in touch with, but imperfectly. The Venn diagrams are like these non-overlapping or not fully overlapping circles, and so that sort of tells us like actually, to a certain degree, there's a bursting at the seams quality to this, but there's a deeper problem too, which is OpenAI in this instance seems to be institutionally pushing out the people who care the most about safety. This is the second time. Let's not forget, Ilya Sutskever, Jan Laika, the heads of their super alignment team, they have lost their heads of AI, basically AI safety or super intelligence safety, for the second time in their company's history. Like, this is a repeated thing where they lose the entirety of their leadership for arguably the most important safety and control efforts at the company. They've got these whistleblowers coming out. I don't think it's nothing. It's not nothing that the New York Times article, the sort of open letter that gets published, has a bunch of signatories from OpenAI, and the ones that are currently at OpenAI, 100% of them are anonymous. It's not nothing that list is anonymized, especially when you look at the fact that OpenAI created an internal whistleblower hotline a few months ago, actually like literally 4 days before I think our report came out. The extent to which that is viewed as a serious and sincere and meaningful channel for whistleblowers to actually share concerns within the company can perhaps arguably be measured by the number of OpenAI whistleblowers who've decided to take to the media and elsewhere rather than use that internal channel. I think that's kind of an interesting measure. You could have a debate about whether that's true, but it's got to be an indication of something. And it certainly is consistent with, some of the stuff that we've heard. So I think there's a lot of kind of whistleblower fractals, if you will, people who introduce you to other people. And I think the network of people who are concerned is plausibly a lot bigger than it appears on the surface.
What is it that makes a whistleblower come forward? You've been having these meetings. Do they break sort of like in a night and come the next day? Does it brew for a long time? And what are the qualities of a whistleblower that you've observed?
I think it's honestly probably not too dissimilar from what made us get into this field in the first place. If you think about this from, the trend in the long term, what's going to happen in the future, what are the risks perspective, and what does that mean for me, right? This doesn't necessarily have to be altruistic. It doesn't have to be, it's just like me and my family, I got a daughter on the way, like that kind of thing. I want my family to be safe. What about this is putting my family at risk? And there are a lot of these elements. I think for many people, it's really is just as simple as that.
Yeah. So you guys write the report. I wanted to take a couple, obviously many months to put this thing together.
God, dude, this is a battle. Fucking okay. So it was so much work in that.
I think Ed's soul is still a little bit like on the keyboard of his computer right now.
Yeah, no, it's still like absolutely splattered. Okay, so we did the bulk of our engagements with the labs kind of in early to mid 23, and then I kind of sat down. We repeated like kind of iterations of this. I ended up writing the bulk of it because I had kind of my finger on a lot of these threads. Of course, other folk, like massive contributions from other folks, but just in terms of time sitting clacking at the keyboard, it was kind of on my fingers, I guess, as it were.
Sure.
So
and can I just ask you just real quick, Jeremie, just like emotionally, like you're at your laptop in your house or your office or wherever you normally are, and the stuff you are typing on your keyboard could be some of the most important work done in the history of humanity. Like, what is it like to be working on this stuff just on a level of knowing the seriousness of the subject?
I think you said Jeremie there. You might have meant Ed, but
sorry.
I'll agree with you. But Ed,
yeah.
Really, yeah.
So this is kind of, so there were kind of two versions of it. We did one version that we kind of shipped as a draft at the mid or end of September, and that one felt like fucking amazing. It was like, oh yeah, this is it. Like we're nailing it. This is amazing. Like it felt like we were bringing everything together. Everything was like fresh in the head. Like it was awesome. And then in early November, we held a workshop with a number of interagency folks from across the government. This was attended by folks from the White House, so Executive Office of the President, OSTP, and various folks, DOD, State Department, like the whole, alphabet soup of everybody. And the point of this workshop was, okay, take this thing that we've put together and just rip it to shreds. Because now that we've taken all these recommendations from the technical side, from the labs, from the officials, from the whistleblowers, from all of these components, now we need to actually bash that into the reality of what can be implemented in policy, right? What are the existing authorities, and what can be done with existing laws, and what's realistic about new laws that can be construed and drafted, and all of these things pulled together. So you had this massive expertise over 3 days of just, and that was absolutely brutal and painful, because there's so much of our stuff that they were like, yeah, no, you can't do that. That's stupid. And almost worse was the thing where it's like, oh yeah, that's interesting, but you actually could do that in this whole other way that is really cool, but that requires you to read this, 50 or 100, 200 page statute to understand exactly what you can and can't do. And so that second phase, where we took this gigantic thing that we had, this gigantic pile of feedback from, the other side of all these incredible people, and kind of smushed it together and just stirred it up in a pot and kind of brought it out into this final report. I'm not gonna lie, that was the most brutally painful part. So the part where we were like, oh yeah, this is the shit, we're doing it. That was before. But the reality of actually having to make something that might work with existing government authorities, oh, that hurt, man. That really hurt.
Wow. Was there what was the hardest crunch of your vision was, we can do this, and then it was just no, you got to do this?
I think it was what can you do under existing law? What can you do under existing law without and kind of in a way that's politically feasible? And so you have to structure. It's just it's brutal, because you also have to kind of structure it as a series of fallback positions. Look, here's the ideal thing that we think can be done under regulations A, B, C, X, Y, Z. But, realistically, unless something major happens that really moves the needle, public opinion in a significant way, it's going to be very hard for the executive branch to do that without facing really strong opposition from kind of across the board. And so if you can't do that, then what's the next best thing? And why is that the next best thing? And why meeting people where they are in terms of the resistance that folks naturally and reasonably have to a holistic plan like this was one of the hardest parts, because something like this only makes sense if you really do think that there is at least a reasonable chance that there is catastrophic risk from weaponization, and also some chance of loss of control risk. If you remove either of those two ingredients, a lot of the measures don't make sense, or make perhaps less sense. And it doesn't have to be guaranteed that there's loss of control risk, but just there's some reasonable potential for that, which is kind of our view.
I think on the plus side, the advantage of going through this awful process, the red teaming of this by 100 different, basically the US's top experts, or some of the top experts on weapons of mass destruction, AI, technology, governance, policy, all that jazz, is that, especially for Ed, because he was at the center of this, he integrated all that data, and also with the technical picture that we had, and in his head, in one brain. And I think it's fair to say, there is no, as far as I can tell, there probably is no expert on planet Earth who knows more about the complete picture than Ed, Frank. That may sound like a bold claim, but it's actually given the rooms, the access that we had, not just to the frontier labs, the world's top AI labs, the whistleblowers at those labs, the fact that Ed is doing technical AI safety research with the world's best researchers, and then also the governance of policy, the access to people who have clearances and friggin' like a picture on how tabletop exercises get done, governance. Ed was reading freaking statutes all day. Like all of that has not existed, I'm sure, in the head of one person before this project. And that was really special because we got to then sit back and kind of war game a little bit with an unusual level of clarity on how might things actually play out. Not just like, let's throw around policies that could make sense, but like actually knowing what is in the art of the possible from a legislative standpoint, from a policy standpoint. It was really fascinating, and in a weird way, one of the best parts of the exercise, at least for me, because we were able to get this clear picture after all that time spent looking at the problem.
It was an incredibly enriching experience.
I believe it. I'm so thankful that you guys were able to do it and to come up with this stuff. I truly believe that it is like some of the most important work happening on the entire planet. So where do you go from here? I want you to keep going into rooms with the execs and the whistleblowers and to continue doing this work. Is it like sort of, we did the report, thank you very much, or is there a continuing project? Is there another report? Does it grow from here? What happens?
I think I guess one thing is there are ways to support the U.S. government's involvement in this space informally and formally. We're interested in both and pursuing both. We can't share too many details on that side, but certainly, anything that broadly helps the U.S. government deal with this risk set, understand it better, we're certainly pushing ahead on that. We are working on so we're still in touch with a lot of the folks, all the folks really that we connected with through this project, and a lot more that have since come forward, obviously in the wake of a lot of the sort of the launch of the action plan, the investigation, all that. So bridging that gap between like the Silicon Valley and DC hubs is really our big focus right now, and starting to bring this to the attention of legislators. So we've had a lot of meetings on Capitol Hill, a lot of staff meetings, trying to help to convey the sort of this packaged information that we've been getting, and maintain their situational awareness in the space as the U.S. starts to figure out what is our legislative posture going to look like heading into 2025, 2026, as these big training runs start to roll out. So that's kind of been our focus, is the legislative piece and the whistleblower piece.
As a private, sorry,
no, go ahead. I was going to say, how's it going? So go for it. Yeah.
No, I was just going to add, as a private sector entity that hasn't taken funding still from any major donor or VC or anything like that, we have the flexibility, right? Still, this is still like one of our core strengths. We have the flexibility to do things and to say things that government officials and agencies can't do or say, and that none of the existing players in the ecosystem can do or say. And there's a lot of value in that flexibility for various players to work through us and collaborate with us. And so we're helping out as many folks as we can. We're not being too specific yet, but as things roll out, hopefully we'll be able to say a little bit more about the specifics of what we're doing.
In terms of how
is it fair to say that like generally you are building upon the report, building upon that effort, going forward from there, that it's getting, the work continues?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. And I think one of the key things that we've seen too is increasing amounts of traction on the core messaging, getting people to understand the loss of control side. I think, 2 years ago, when you would talk to people on both sides of the house, really, there'd be very limited uptake because it sounded speculative. But now you have massive corporate cap tables being refactored on the basis of concerns over these sorts of technological trends. You have essentially like huge capital investments from companies like Microsoft, Google, Nvidia, and so on, building these things. Like it's very clear to people that something is happening. And so people's imaginations don't really have to do much work. You can get them there a lot more easily. And I think the whistleblower piece has been so important. It's like we're glad that when we came out in public, I think it was really the first report that ever came forward with a bunch of whistleblower concerns from the frontier labs. That was something that was interesting because for the longest time, you talk to your friends in the labs, they would tell you stuff that would have your jaw on the floor, and you'd be like, why are people not why is this not out there? This gave us an ability to package and share that, frankly, so that now legislators can look at the facts of the matter, like stare the reality in the face of like these are the water cooler conversations happening at the frontier labs. Like this is, whether you like it or not, these people who know an awful lot more than you about the technology, and they have to. They're the world experts on the stuff. This is how they're thinking about it. They may be wrong, but this is how they're thinking about it. So yeah, we found that sort of start to pay dividends. It's set in motion a series of events. Obviously, we've had a lot of whistleblower stuff come after, as the sort of momentum's picked up on the whistleblower side. So we're pleased with what's happened in the aftermath, related or unrelated in complex ways to the initial project that we ran, and now it really feels like pushing a ball more and more downhill rather than uphill.
Amazing. Do you feel like you have changed the culture around whistleblowing at the Frontier Labs?
I think the culture around whistleblowing at the Frontier Labs has changed, and it has changed as a result, in part, of this project. We know we've had firsthand accounts from whistleblowers that were sobering and unfortunate in terms of the response of some labs to the fact of their having blown the whistle. Like, it's unfortunate, right? Because really, with these concerns, these are very real, sincere, legitimate concerns. So it would be nice if the response were more like, okay, let's try to like engage with these folks, and not like engage in a campaign to identify who they are and go on a witch hunt, but rather, and I'm not saying that's what they did, but the interpretation of some of the folks we spoke to could tend in that direction. And that was a little bit concerning, especially given the public statements being made by these labs about how seriously they take this risk. So in that sense, I think that culture, that cultural change is maybe not the best thing. We kind of anticipated something like this, right? You come forward with these whistleblower concerns, there's going to be a back reaction, especially depending on the nature of the lab and perhaps how seriously they may take some of these issues. But that was, I think, an unfortunate and predictable and predicted thing that happened. I think it has kind of created in the zeitgeist awareness of whistleblowing at these labs as a thing. And hopefully that comes with more pressure for formal channels for this sort of stuff, so that it's out of the hands of any individual lab to say who gets to say what and to whom.
Yeah. So a lot of the report is recommendations, things you guys think, should be implemented, things we should do. Is there anything, one or two or three of those, that sort of stand out to you that, maybe aren't talked about a lot, but you think are very viable?
I think situational awareness on the part of the government about where the technology is and where it's headed is just an obvious win. This is something you can put together with existing authorities and existing agencies. This is something you could do. The budget is kind of the biggest constraint there. Another thing is just education, re-educating government folks so they understand this stuff. Things like contingency planning, things like what are called indicators and warnings. So in other words, if some lab in the United States is doing something and all of a sudden things are getting concerning in whatever way, how would you know? How would the government know? What indicators would the government be tracking? How would it process that information? How would that information flow up into the executive and down into an action? Like that basic, how do you structure that, like, oh shit moment from an institutional perspective?
Yeah. So like, do you, on the weekend when Sam Altman got fired and then rehired that weekend, was the phone ringing at the Defense Department? Like, did they know what was going on, or did everybody just pick up the paper on Monday and be like, oh, he got rehired?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think so. I don't think that is something that
certainly not in the Defense Department.
Yeah, not in the Defense Department.
But I guess, is there a phone that starts to ring that is somehow causally connected to a rational downstream action? Very, very unclear, though things have improved in that respect, right? We now have Sam Altman sitting essentially on a board with Secretary Mayorkas at the Department of Homeland Security and a bunch of other folks tracking risks from AI. Now, depending on where you fall on the Sam Altman piece, you may be more or less concerned about the fact that he is having a direct personal influence on another board. But in any case, that certainly there are formal channels being shaped up and informal ones. I think, by the way, another important recommendation that sometimes sounds unsexy, especially people that don't like talking about the hardware stuff because it's not the cool model stuff. The hardware stuff is so important, though. Supply chain controls, right? Continuing to make sure that China doesn't get their hands on controlled technologies up and down the AI supply chain, all those nodes trying to choke them off. But crucially, also,
I'm sorry. Actually, probably the single most important security. So we talked about this, but improving frontier lab security for not cybersecurity, physical security, operational security, all those practices across the board for model weights and for some of the key insights about how algorithmic improvements that allow you to scale up training with less compute, because those improvements potentially allow an actor with less compute to train up more powerful models. So that's a whole other dimension we didn't talk about, but that is a big risk, and it kind of increases the risk threshold over time. Security is probably, if there was nothing else right now, that's probably where you put your points.
I'd extend security.
Do they own the security risk? Do they concede the point, or are they like, no, we got this, it's fine? Or are they like, no, we're Swiss cheese?
So, internally for many of the labs, the self-assessment is like, yeah, we're Swiss cheese. The thing is, like, the externality is borne by us rather than entirely by the lab, right? So, and this is also, it factors into the race dynamics as well. It's like, if you're in a race, do you put your marginal dollar into like more scale, more compute, more GPUs and stuff? Or do you put it into more safety, more security, right? Increasing frictions, because security has costs beyond the financial. It means you're siloing information. It means you're tracking ins and outs. It means you have like access cards. It means you have locks on doors, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All of that means more frictions, less free communication, more barriers to kind of open research environments and things like this. It's hard to manage those two things if you haven't done it. And so, yeah, it becomes a question of, well, if I implement all these security precautions, well, my competitors are going to pull ahead and so forth.
I think on the
Right.
hardware side too, just to circle back to that, we're talking about this idea of export controls, and the action plan has a bunch of essentially holes in the export control regime that we identified. They're like, okay, actually, you want to add this to your list and so on. But another key thing is investing heavily in research on essentially on-chip governance. So basically, technologies that would allow you to assess what a GPU is being used for and intercede if you find it's being used for the wrong thing. This is necessary when you look at the really large-scale training runs, and it's actually strategically very interesting. If the US wanted to ship GPUs, to have Nvidia ship better GPUs to China, and therefore to reduce the domestic demand in China for more advanced GPUs, thereby slowing down their own R&D, their own progress, potentially. There are a bunch of asterisks, but potentially. One of the things you could do is on-chip governance, basically give the US the ability to just like shut down those puppies from a distance in a way that's tamper-proof and provably so. There's a whole research program that just puts more optionality on the table. And this could apply also to domestic labs, right? If you have labs that decide to skirt around regulation, you need a way to enforce that. You need a way to enforce it quickly and cheaply. These things create tons of optionality in that direction. So we're really big fans, and we put a lot of recommendation time and energy in the action plan pointed in this direction of like on-chip monitoring and governance, remote shutdown capabilities that are tamper-proof and all that for top-of-the-line GPUs.
Wow. And is that the same kind of thing where it would be giving away its location like every minute or 30 seconds or whatever, that kind of thing that Eliezer talks about, where they're sort of reporting back so you can see if they're clustering anywhere?
Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of variations on this theme, and it would depend on the specific kind of governance strategies you want, the cost associated with the R&D and all that stuff. We highlight a couple of sort of desired features of these governance schemes, but ultimately, yeah, there are entire research programs pointed in that direction. Knowing location, definitely helpful. One of the key features here is also just like being able to shut them off, right? Like just having that clean binary filter.
Yeah.
You don't have to use it. You would want that to be incredibly carefully set up and have a regulatory body with oversight powers that is informed and responsible and takes a light touch as much as possible. But again, clear indicators and warnings, clear contingency plans, if this, then that you decide on ahead of time. So we're not running around like chickens with their heads cut off if something does happen.
What are the obstacles and timing around that? Like why wouldn't it happen? Why hasn't it happened? How long would it take to happen?
The hardware. Government stuff.
Getting chips with the hardware stuff in them.
So there's actually stuff already. If you look at the latest Nvidia, like the H100 GPU already has some really cool governance features on board. There are things that allow you to pull off like a minimum viable product version of this. Probably in the next, like if you really wanted to, like you could do something in the next 12 months that would at least put points on the board. But the full on there's a great paper that goes into like the staging of this. So today we can do stuff with, partner labs who use these GPUs in good faith. We're willing to be honest about how they're using them. Then there are people who, might want to tamper with the device, and it's like they can tamper with it successfully, but it leaves clear evidence of tampering. That's another use case. So maybe that's, domestic labs that you don't necessarily trust, but whose equipment you can at least inspect. And then you have that third concentric circle, which is absolutely tamper-proof, not just tamper-resistant, remote shutdown, on-chip monitoring, all that stuff. That is more like, 3 to 4 years away in terms of coming online. But that's why you need to start it like yesterday, right? You really want to start at encouraging companies like Nvidia to double and triple down on this sort of thing. Nvidia has the same kind of ROI incentive problem that the frontier labs face, right? The frontier labs are like, more capabilities, more scale. Nvidia is like, yeah, more scale, more GPUs. They need to be required potentially to invest in these on-chip governance protocols in order to ensure that we actually get there. But there's a whole ecosystem we need to build up around that, academic, research, government, and all that to support that kind of work.
Would they lobby against the hardware measures? Is Nvidia principally supportive?
So I really like Nvidia as a startup founder because Jensen, their founder and CEO, is so awesomely aggressive in every domain. He's so like, he pushes things so hard. And I just like, as a startup guy, I love that. He definitely, so Nvidia following through on that cultural trait, has behaved in the past as though regulations like this are an obstacle to what they want, which, you can say, like, when all's said and done, if you add it all together, does it end up being an obstacle or not? It's actually not completely clear, but they very much push aggressively for what they want, is what I'll say.
Okay. I would hope that this would be something they would want. That would be a great alignment of things.
They tend to push against constraints like this.
Right. It's someone else coming in from the outside saying you have to do this with your product. Nobody likes that.
The economics, in fairness, I will say, so one of the key examples of this is U.S. export controls come in to hit China, basically, so that China can't get the latest GPU. Nvidia goes, okay, let's game our GPU design such that it technically qualifies as exportable, but delivers some real horsepower, and also, GPUs that potentially could be retrofitted in different ways. Like, there's all kinds of stuff there. And as the export controls have had to get patched, like, you can see Gina Raimondo at the Department of Commerce kind of going like, okay, Nvidia, like, if not, fuck you. Like, she expressed some real frustration.
Yeah, during 2023, it was actually kind of absurd because you had these insane... So NVIDIA had basically... There was an initial set of export controls on NVIDIA chips that had come through. NVIDIA basically tweaked its chips a little bit to just get around the export controls and still be able to deliver serious horsepower over to China. And you saw these, like, increasingly gigantic orders for NVIDIA chips by, Alibaba, Baidu, like all these Chinese companies. And they were like, many of them were just public. It was like $1 billion, $5 billion. Why not? Let's keep going. And because NVIDIA knew that the party was going to end at some point, they actually prioritized Chinese chip deliveries over American chip deliveries so they could get paid before the door slammed shut. It was that insane.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence for this kind of thinking across the frontier AI development community. Like, sadly, I think people at a certain point get distracted by chasing the AGI thing or the short-term profit motive and lose sight of the national security imperative or just like the patriotic imperative. Like OpenAI, there's this article that came out how they were internally. There was, according to a whistleblower who's since been let go from OpenAI, Leopold. They were thinking about, the leadership was talking about essentially starting a bidding war between China and Russia and the United States over who would, right? So look, this is not inconsistent with what we have heard internally from people. And this is just sort of like, they see their imperative. Many of them do or may see their imperative as being to just build AGI, in some cases at almost any cost. Like, there is a subset of folks who work at the frontier labs who are sort of the transhumanist stripe. They kind of think like, I want to build this because I want to shed my horrifying meat machine body like Agent Smith in the Matrix. God, the smell of humans just upsets me. Like this is, I'm barely caricaturing here. It's not everybody. It's not even a majority, but it's an important subset, and culturally an important kind of culturally defining subset. So, when you look at these sorts of very, even if casual conversations about, we're going to like, what does that tell you about the alignment with the sort of the interests of the average American? I mean, I think it's a little concerning, and to the extent that these things are true, and at least they're not inconsistent with some of the things that we've heard, that's worrisome. So Nvidia's the hardware part of that story. There's the frontier labs, but it's a whole ecosystem.
Yeah. All right. I just got a couple last questions for you guys. I really am so thankful for your time. So the election has happened, and it turns out in an upset, the Harris brothers are now the co-presidents of the country. You can battle that out. What is the first thing you do? What's the first thing you do? Obviously, it's related to AI risk.
I think the first thing no, go ahead, Ed.
maybe we can battle it out. But I think the security side, everything that the executive can do to beef up frontier lab security, we do that.
And I think the next step would be engaging really deeply with Congress, because I think at this point, the executive can only do so much. The congressional action is what's needed. And there are, you would want Congress to understand the risks from the perspective of a lot of the whistleblowers who actually have built with their own hands these systems. Like, this is really something that's super important. And keep in mind, there's a ton of selective pressure at OpenAI. The people who are left there after 2 rounds of their safety leadership team leading on them, that is a strong selection effect for the people who are left over to be more casual and laissez-faire about safety. But even at that, a lot of the people who are left over are really concerned. And certainly the whistleblowers who have left are really concerned. Hearing from them in Congress in the form of testimony and, having hearings about the whistleblower issues, closed hearings, open hearings, some combination, I think really, really important. And I think, the president might be in a position to kind of advocate for that sort of thing as well, informally, by, talking to the majority leaders, and so on. So, I think the legislative piece, weirdly, being elected president makes you go, oh, I think the grass is greener, but, the legislative piece is really important.
Would you say that I think I am comfortable saying that I am against AGI, just knowing that it is unaligned and we don't know how it works. If we could solve the safety questions, then I think I would be for AGI. Are you guys against AGI?
I think AGI with no qualifiers, impossible to answer. I think if we can align it, 100%. 100%. I think at that point, if we figure out a way to provably or satisfactorily provably align an AGI, I think we have a moral imperative to build it. I think full steam ahead with a lot of thought, attention paid to how we roll it out and how we transform society. Because we're talking about a really fundamental transformation. We need to think about what we do with jobs and people's sense of purpose and meaning, all that stuff. Then we get to tackle those questions. But I think ultimately, I want a cure for cancer. I want a way to, make sure that my kids lead happy, fulfilled lives. I don't want lineups at the hospital. I want people to get to see an automated, hyper-effective shrink if they need it. I don't want people to have their backs hurting and all that. I want that. The question is about alignment. And if you can't align it, I think everybody would just say this. Misaligned, no. Aligned, yes. Done. I think the question is, what is the standard of proof for alignment? Who owns the burden of proof for how aligned the system is. How do you measure that? Who makes that call? Right now, we're sitting on a giant stack of apparent governance failures, one might argue, at labs like OpenAI. Certainly some people have argued that. To the extent that there are any questions like that about the literal lab that internally believes it will build AGI, that is a big, big problem. And I think that is where the kind of conversation ought to be focused. That's anyway, my 2 cents.
Sure. Okay, last question. You guys are both, congratulations, going to become fathers here in the next few months. That is so exciting. And I think you will experience a change in your sort of perspective if you haven't already. How do you frame the future given these issues and your coming children?
Yeah, I was speaking to a frontier AI researcher who works on safety, who himself is a father of 4, about this very question. Because, yeah, you think about, can you really imagine my daughter going to college 18 years from now? Like, it's actually hard to imagine that. It's hard to imagine that. I don't know. Maybe my daughter wants to be an artist. What do I tell her, right? Like, art has been automated now, I think that fundamentally it comes down to, at the end of the day, you can't let go of the things that make you human. And this is one of the fundamental human and humanizing things that exists. And so if you let go of something like that, if you say like, it's so depressing, I just don't want to have kids at all, you've defeated yourself in your own mind before you've even begun. And so I think that this is an action that is a hopeful action, and that I'm proudly taking and delighted to take.
Yeah, I just absolutely double down on that. I think children are the ultimate expression of our hope in the future. There's no more primal demonstration of sort of human optimism than that. And I just think, one of the pervasive challenges in the AI safety ecosystem is you've got a lot of sort of doomer people who approach it with this sort of defeatist mindset. And apart from the fact that this makes it such that you will never be able to convince other people who, for various reasons, right, might want to convince themselves, be in denial, whatever, approaching it with a doomer mindset, also makes it less likely that you will be effective personally. There's fulfillment that comes from having children that, can be motivating. I mean, it gives me another reason to get up and hit the keyboard, and for Ed, sadly, to hit his keyboard even more. But yeah, I mean, it's a very powerful thing. And I think it's like, if we end up giving up on that, then like AGI or no AGI, we find ourselves, kind of throwing in the towel early. And I think that's something to avoid.
Yeah, it would be like we would be volunteering humanity out of the picture by giving up like that. No need for that. Guys, I am so thankful for your time and for this conversation. I really, really appreciate it. I'm so thankful for the work that you all are doing. I want to see Gladstone AI have like 50,000 employees tomorrow and be just doing massive amounts of this kind of work. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, John. This is a ton of fun. Yeah.
I truly am so thankful for Jeremie and Edward and the work they are doing. They give me hope for the future. I'm excited to know them and look forward to collaborating with them in the future. So you might think that making a podcast every week about the end of the world coming would be depressing. It was that way for me for a bit, but I have found the mental process around AI X risk actually to be sort of a circular journey, moving from unaware and fine to shock and disbelief, to depression, to mourning, but then back around to the other side and back out to a new and better place. Mourning gave way to agency and action and energy. I do not believe I cannot make a difference. I do not believe this is hopeless. I am working every day to fight artificial intelligence existential risk, and the work The fight itself has done me a ton of good mentally every day. So I want to talk for a minute about using your fears of AI doom as a means to better mental health. That's right. Believing we're all going to die in possibly horrible ways far sooner than any of us imagine, as I do, has actually freed me. I'm not worried about most of the things I used to worry about. I just don't have any time anymore for bullshit. I'm using all of my time to do the things I care about, being the best father I can be to my kids, working every day as hard as I can to wake the world up to AI risk, running my company so I can provide for my family and be creative. That's it. Nothing else really matters anymore. So like in relationships that I have, relationships that I care about a lot, I'm cutting myself off emotionally to some degree. Like if I have a friend who is upset with me and I just don't believe there's anything I can do about it, I'm not overthinking it anymore. I'm not letting other people's problems get in my way in that way. I'm not looking for ways to help with that anymore. My attention is elsewhere. I'm just not going to take a minute of my time on Earth as one of the last humans doing anything I don't want to do. It's like the ultimate healthy boundary. My strong belief our default future is AI doom has enabled me to live more positively, to be more in the present, and to act with more self-determination than I ever have before. So I guess I'm saying, give it a try, right? Take something you would have worried about this week and just say, fuck it. That's below the line now. I just don't care. It is liberating. It is overdue. Make new boundaries. Our time here has never been more precious or more fleeting. And get active. See how daily action reduces your fear and depression. All right, that's all of that. I got one more thing. So before I go, I wanted to let you know that I am starting a nonprofit to raise money for AI risk awareness. The first project will be funding advertising campaigns for this podcast. It is called Dads Against AGI, and friend of For Humanity, Louis Berman, is doing a ton of work on this. I will have much more to say about this in the coming weeks. Okay, friends, it is 2024 and we don't know how long we have to live, so we celebrate every day like it's our last, and we end every show with something we call the celebration of life, just something that makes us thrilled to be alive. It's the summer here in America, and the summer means the beach here in the American mid-Atlantic. I grew up in D.C., live in Baltimore now. The beaches of Delaware have always been the place people from D.C. and Maryland go. One beach in particular sits above the rest. I have been going to Rehoboth Beach in Delaware since I was a very little kid. My own kids have gone there their whole lives. It's just the perfect American beach town. So here are just a few sights and sounds from a day at the beach. Okay, my friends, that is all for this week. Please remember, AI risk is not someone else's problem. It is yours and it is mine. And in the words of Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. For humanity, I'm John Sherman. I will see you right back here next week.